Good evening. One of the things I'm hoping to do is discuss classic albums. I've already discussed a few interesting albums worth discussing. Not necessarily the best albums, those will certainly be in there, but interesting albums that have something interesting to talk about historically or musically, like Eric Clapton's Rainbow Concert or John Lennon Live Peace in Toronto. In the near future, I'm going to be discussing what I think are some of the best live albums that are ever made. And when I do, this album I want to discuss tonight will certainly be on there, and that is Live Bullet by Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, recorded at Cobo Hall in Detroit, Michigan, I believe back in 1975, when Bob Seger was rising. He was not yet a national star, but he was huge in Detroit. And I'm lucky enough that I can remember that period because, in my opinion, that was the great period of Bob Seger when he was a bar band, struggling working class bar. Look at that album. And the Silver Bullet Band, one of the great bar bands in the history of bar bands. I mean, look up bar band in the dictionary, you're going to see a picture of the Silver Bullet Band. And tonight I want to just talk a little bit about this fantastic live album. They just don't make live albums any better than this. And I wanted to say a little bit about it. A little bit of background to this great album. Bob Seger was born in 1945 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as he famously says on this recording when he introduces the band. So he's what, 75 now? Wow. But he came up, he was quite a track star, I guess, apparently. But working class roots, and I think Detroit always embraced him for that kind of seemed like the kind of guy you could have a beer with or work, if he weren't singing rock and roll, he'd probably be working on the assembly line back when they had good jobs in Detroit, Michigan. And he kicked around Detroit just playing everywhere. It was kind of funny because when Night Moves came out, he was described as kind of an overnight sensation, and he'd been playing just dive bars all over Michigan for years. Talk about paying your dues. He's a walking example of paying your dues. When I was a kid, people would still always talk about how he used to play in Walled Lake and roller skating rinks and bars, and there was a cheap little amusement park there he played at, along with Ted Nugent and Mitch Ryder and people like that. And he was really part of that Detroit scene that was so special. And but he played a lot. He had a hit with Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. He used to play with Glenn Frey from the Eagles, who's also from Detroit before he moved to California. And he had some really good early songs, heavy music, Looking Back, 2 + 2 is on my mind. You Can Call Me Lucifer. Turn the Page was one of those early songs, but he never really broke. And when I was a kid, I listened to him first. One of the first albums I ever bought was Beautiful Loser, which was still kind of in that. That was kind of a breakthrough album, but it was still pretty much in that period where he was He was very popular in Detroit, and Beautiful Loser was probably really popular in Detroit. You heard a lot of that. And that was probably, in terms of Detroit radio, a breakthrough album. Beautiful Loser. It had Traveling Man, Beautiful Loser, Catmandu. I mean, they wore that out. That was a huge hit. So, and that was kind of in the days of regional music. You'd have West Coast bands like Janis Joplin and, the Grateful Dead. You had Southern bands. You had New England bands, New York bands, and they you'd hear them in other parts of the country, but there was a more regional aspect to music then, and I think it was kind of cool. And Detroit had its own little cadre of music and its own little sound of hard driving rock and roll, not metal, not heavy metal, not necessarily even hard rock, although they did do hard rock, but rock and roll, you know, kind of an outgrowth of the 50s. And Bob Seger was right in that sweet spot of rock and roll music. And when Beautiful Loser came out, they, like Kathmandu, they played that all the time. I remember that. And then in 1975, on the heels of that, he recorded a couple nights at Cobo Hall in Detroit, Michigan. I don't live in Detroit anymore, so I'm not even sure. I think it's still there. I don't know if they have many concerts there, but it used to be a big concert venue, and I've seen many a show there myself. Cobo Hall. And not too long after that, they came out with this album, From Those Nights. And they were just magic nights. The interesting thing about this was it was huge in Detroit. I mean, Let It Rock, some of these songs were just played so much on Detroit radio, and yet he still was not a national star. When Night Moves came out the following year, then he had some national hits and national recognition. But this album and Beautiful Loser, today they're more well known, but at that time those were Detroit radio phenomena. I guess that was before Clear Channel Communication and some of these lawyers and corporations took over radio so much that you couldn't, that, you know, DJs played what they wanted, and you know they'd play a lot of Bob Seger if they liked Bob Seger, and they all did. So I'm going to say, let me just play a little guitar here, and then we'll say a little bit more about this awesome album. This album, recorded at Cobo Hall, just has so many good songs on it. It's a double album. Opens up with the Ike Turner classic Nutbush City, and he just does that great. He opens up with his signature Hey Detroit. I remember, when I was a kid and, had all that 15-year-old testosterone and adrenaline in my system, I just would thrill, Hey Detroit. He'd come out and scream that. And he said, I told everybody last night, I was reading in the Rolling Stone where they said Detroit City is has the best rock and roll in the world or something like that. And he said, I thought to myself, shit, I've known that for 10 years, And he does just that super duper outstanding Traveling Man, Beautiful Loser. That is just, and that's just live band. That's not fancy. It's just a really good bar band, and you can tell they played that a lot. And it's just that's got that great guitar work in it by Drew Abbott, and I'll say a little bit more about him in a minute. But all the songs on here, it's rock and roll. It's not a big band. It's a pared down bar. Like I said, it's a bar band. They got a guitar player, keyboard, super good alto reed on sax, and he used to get up on the speakers and play his saxophone from the top of those speakers that were the size of little skyscrapers, back in those days. And he'd get up there and play those saxophone solos, and he's right up there with the guy who played for Bruce Springsteen, just a great sax player. It's got Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, a really good version of Let It Rock, which is another great song, which is a Chuck Berry medley actually, and that was the one he would introduce the band on. Heavy Music, Looking Back. Of course, Kathmandu, Bo Diddley. The other song on here that's become quite a radio staple over the years, was not at the time, it was kind of an album track back then, was Turn the Page, kind of a song about the road. There's just a spirit on this album, and that you can tell he's in his hometown. They love him, he loves them. He's at the top of his game, in great voice. His band is red hot. Just capturing artist on his way up. And the thing I like, I think on Wikipedia, I actually wrote the beginning of that. Back in the days when Wikipedia didn't have much on it, I wrote a few entries. It's been changed a lot, but what I wrote was the beginning of that Live Bullet entry, and about Cobo Hall. And but I think Dave Marsh has a quote on there that, you know, it was like Seger singing like he had one last shot. This is my last shot, you know, kind of like Rocky. This is it, man. I've been playing in the bars 10 years. If they don't like this, you know, this is about as good as I can do, you know. And it's just that you know, the man in the arena kind of feeling, and just putting it out there, you know, and he did it, you know. And it's an awesome album, and it's an awesome band. Funny thing about Live Bullet is they just wore it out on Detroit radio. And I actually went to school in Wheaton, Illinois. And I saw Bob Seger. I didn't see him at that Cobo concert, but I did see the other huge Detroit concert that was a little bit after that at the Pontiac Silverdome in June, I think, of '76. And that was like 80,000 people. And it was probably one of the biggest events in the history of the Pontiac Silverdome, you know, including like Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith. They had some big shows back then. And what I remember reading about it, that the Seger was at a funny point in his career, and he played at the Silverdome, and then the next night he was playing at Traverse City in some little bar because he had contract obligations. And I think that ended fairly quickly, but it was kind of weird. He was transitioning, you know, he was a bar musician. The other thing is, when I went to Chicago, no one had heard about it, and I had friends that knew good music. I mean, that's where I heard a lot of, I was exposed to a lot of great music when I lived in Chicago, because I had some friends that were really into, you know, had a lot of good albums. And they hadn't heard of Bob Seger. Now, I hadn't been there too long, and then Night Moves came out, and of course that was a huge radio hit. And I also want to say a little bit about the Silver Bullet Band. The Silver Bullet Band was Bob Seger's old bar band. He, like a lot of players, he played with a bunch of people. You know, you can look at his history. He played with all kinds of people, which would basically be, you know, bar musicians. And they kind of, you know, at that stage, like you can see in any town, you know, people kind of come in and out of these bands. And but by that time, he had the Silver Bullet Band, which was a really good band. And the really, I think one of the main players in that was, along with Alto Reed, was Drew Abbott on the guitar. And it's kind of an interesting little backstory to that. Drew Abbott did all that really good guitar work, and he was a rock and roll guitar player, just old school barroom rock and roll. And the Silver Bullet Band, you listen to them, they'd take those 3-chord songs, like you listen to Let It Rock, it's a 3-chord rocker. It's just C, F, G the whole time. But they would add little things in it, little breaks, little stops, kind of introduce the band, quiet it down, bring it back up, and then kind of have a big finish. And they'd take those old rock and roll songs and really make them special and memorable and not boring. And that's what a good rock and roll band does. They take that old rock and roll, and they dress it up without killing the sort of raw simplicity of it. And if you want to hear people really play, you know, 3-chord rock and roll well, listen to the Silver Bullet Band, and they just honed all those breaks and stops and starts and the dynamics of making that music sound so great in bars all over Michigan. And Drew Abbott was a great guitar player. One interesting thing, when Night Moves came out, Bob Seger started using other musicians. So like Main Street, for example, the whole second side of Night Moves, I believe, is Muscle Shoals. And I think there was a smoother commercial side to that. Like a lot of times that, you see with a lot of artists, that probably helped Bob Seger commercially, but it did alienate him from the Silver Bullet Band. And he played with this. That was kind of his live band, but a lot of his stuff in the later '70s was done with studio musicians, and he'd used the Silver Bullet Band more sparingly, and then they were kind of his live band. And I think that increasingly drove a wedge between Seger and Drew Abbott. I don't know about some of the other guys. I know I think he still plays with Alto Reed. I haven't kept up with Bob Seger that much, unfortunately. I keep saying I want to see him. But and of course that Muscle Shoals did great. They're great. So they did, like, I think they played Come to Papa and on Night Moves. But if you want to hear the Silver Bullet Band, I mean, that's just an old Detroit bar band, about as good as a bar band gets. And they were awesome. And they were a bar band. I mean, you can just feel the sweat and the beer and people dancing. I mean, you just listen to them play and you can just see it in your mind, back in those days when people danced and rock and rolled in bars, so it's a very special band, the Silver Bullet Band. So that's what I wanted to say about Live Bullet. It's a fantastic album. If you haven't heard it, it's definitely one of the must-have live albums. And I think for anybody from Detroit, it's especially special, because it is kind of, it belongs to the period when Seger was not nationally famous. So if you're from Detroit, you probably heard it just like, it was almost like Frampton Comes Alive or Leonard Skinner's live version of Freebird or something. But for a lot of other people, it wasn't. Now, I think over the years, it's been, people hear it more. But I think still, for people that grew up in Detroit in that period, this was an album, like I said, it was like Frampton Comes Alive, or, it was just a ubiquitous presence on the radio. And they did play a lot of live albums on the radio, and this one got played a lot. And it really captures an artist in his prime, on the way up. And it's a special moment in history. I imagine for Bob Seger, it must be a very special moment in his life. That kind of, that uncertainty, but that feeling like, that we're getting pretty good here. And you can just hear it, the excitement of their music. And it's got organ in it, and it's just a really well done album. And it's not fancy. It's a working class Detroit album. It's a lot like Mitch Ryder or Old Ted Nugent, the Rockets, all those bands kind of had that quality, but they were good. They had good players and they wrote good songs from the heart. They were a little bit like Springsteen in that Seger wrote songs with good lyrics, but not over people's heads. He wasn't singing about topographic oceans or, Carnival Number 9 or something. He was singing everyday subjects, but in a poetic way. He was a poet of sorts, for sure, and would connect with people. And there are just so many good songs on this album. So I highly recommend, if you haven't heard this album. And Bob Seger's whole catalog's good. But if you're not from Detroit or you're not that familiar with him, I recommend you listen to some of his early stuff from that kind of period when he was paying his dues. He did a lot of really good albums. They're kind of rough sometimes because that's, I guess, what Muscle Shoals was for. They did everything perfect, but But there's some real gems on those early albums, and he kind of took all those years of the bars knocking around, and he took the absolute gems of all of those many years, and he put them together in this show, and you know, kind of distilled down to the very best of what he had, and it was good enough. It was good enough. It was more than good enough. It was awesome. Bob Seger and the Silverbolt Band, Live Bullet.